Hello and welcome back again, everybody. After a somewhat long absence, we are back recording again. Today we will be answering questions from Ella Newey, a graphic design student who subscribed to me on Patreon and asked me a list of questions almost a month ago. And while I apologize for this delay, I also invite you all to ask similar questions on Patreon. For as little as $1 per month, you can be patrons, and if you are, I can answer questions for you. You can get access to a world of free content and creature art I publish nowhere else. And let's be level here. I don't like paywalls. I don't like having to do this, but I have to eat too. And the more you support me, the more time I can find to create YouTube stuff like this one. So yeah, that was that for panhandling and begging. I hope you're all doing well. We are recording on the 12th of December 2024. The year is almost about to end and it's the jolly, cozy holiday season. Without much ado, let's get to Ella's questions. Number 1. What led you into the field of speculative evolution? I have answered this question and similar questions dozens of times before, but if you're paying for it, I'll be happy to answer again. I always liked looking at strange creatures, monsters, weird things, and speculative evolution turned out to be the one surefire way where people can create unusual creatures of their own and also get to substantiate them scientifically. So I gravitated towards it. But all of my other interests, my interest in mythology, my interest in paleontology, my interest in science fiction, even as a child, the cartoons I watched. I had two favorite cartoons: Denver the Last Dinosaur and Transformers. Shows you how old I am. But yeah, I always liked things with unusual non-human characters in it. And nearly 40 years later, here we are. It was an attraction I had since I was conscious of myself, and I found my way into speculative evolution through following it. Number 2. Could you walk me through the creative process when imagining and designing speculative creatures? That's a really great one. There are actually two parallel processes. One goes like this. You look at something that exists and you think more rationally, systematically. For example, you look at this kind of pterosaur, a flying reptile known as Rhamphorhynchus, okay? If you're interested in dinosaurs and paleo stuff, you probably know what Rhamphorhynchus is. It's this famous old-style flying reptile with a kind of rudder-like scale on its tail and big wicked teeth. It was not much bigger than a seagull, but it's one of the paleo art staples. Now, if you study this animal, you will notice that nearly all of its fossils were found in marine deposits. That is to say, they are all fossils that were washed into the sea. In fact, a fossil of Rhamphorhynchus famously was found in association with a big gar-like marine fish. The fish had eaten it and they had both died and fossilized together. This presence of Rhamphorhynchus in marine deposits is so common that some people in the past have speculated that it may have been a marine flying reptile, much like a cormorant or a penguin. And there, the speculative evolution process begins. I think rationally, I say, okay, what if there was a purely marine descendant of this thing? So you draw a kind of Rhamphorhynchus-like creature with shorter wings, maybe even stubbier or penguin-like wings. And of course, if you know about pterosaurs, you will know that their wings are derived from their little fingers. So you adapt that wing plan into something like a fin, and then you make the body bigger and you make the tail stronger, and you arrive at something like a winged crocodile kind of creature. So now that's one way to go at it. Another way is more subconscious and subtle and, dare I say, more mystical. It happens through flashes of inspiration, and it always begins its operation from a purely visual point of view. This happened to me a lot when I was drawing for All Tomorrows, the future history of mankind, which will soon be published as a book from Unbound Books of the UK. But in this book, there's a very famous species named the Koo. They look like dragonflies, but they're supposed to be scary. A lot of people like them. Of course, I, having made them, I'm a bit bored by them, but okay, that's okay. That can fly. The design for the Koo, or if you want to talk more about All Tomorrows, the design for the otter character that appears at the end of All Tomorrows. I'm not gonna spend time explaining it, just Google otter All Tomorrows and you'll see what I'm talking about. These are all very alien, strange, subtle and uncanny looking creatures, and I drew them all in spats of pure improvisation. I wasn't thinking about anything, I was just letting my hand guide itself. Of course, like an engine, the imagination does not run on air. You need something to fuel it with. And yes, I was kind of going through an improvisational trance, but the end result wasn't coming to me from the netherworld. You know, I was drawing on years and years of study of the natural world, of strange creatures and shapes. So like one of those AI engines, you have to train your mind, and the more you study, the more inspiration you will have for your random creations. So there's the two ways you can approach your speculative evolution process. Of course, with the second way, after designing your creature and you come up with this mystical, strange looking creature, you can't explain it at first, but then you have to go back at it and install plumbing. That is to say, determine where it breathes from, how it moves, how it kind of carries itself, what it eats, how it behaves. You can do that retroactively, and while you're doing that, you can also do some extra changes. So imagine you were working purely on mystical improvisation and you create something that's like a very tall stick insect. And then for some reason you want this to be as long as a bus. Now you can then go back and install the plumbing, perhaps when it's a bigger creature, it might need some greater surface area to better cool itself and to manage its respiration. So you can go back and install some flap-like organs to its body. Maybe you can detail its trachea or the holes it breathes from. If it's a huge animal and you drew it with huge eyes, you might want to go back and correct that, because there's a law of optics and physics that basically limits how big an eye can get. Suffice it to say, you don't need huge eyes on a huge creature. In fact, the bigger a creature gets, the smaller its eyes will seem in proportion to its body. There are, of course, exceptions to this. The giant squid and some large fish have enormous eyes that really look comically large. And that's only that way because these things live under the deep sea and they need literally telescope-like huge eyes to receive information from light at those depths. Anyways, that's another little detail you can fix. So, long answer short, two ways. One, step by step, kind of like a more scientifically informed approach. Two, a semi-mystical improvisational approach with two passes. One for the raw creation and a second pass for making it more scientifically believable and sensible. And both of these methods work really well. Number 3, where do you look to for your research? Now, I get this question a lot from my younger viewers, that is to say, people who were born after the year 2000, the iPhone and iPad kids who never imagined a world without the internet. For this generation, inspiration always needs to be researched. I don't understand how this works, but perhaps through universal exposure to computers and smartphones, they find it really difficult to act or even think without a context. If you create something, it must come from a previous source. And yes, to a degree that is true, but also you can also have independent ideas of your own. You can use your own intuition. You can seize your own initiative and just do things. Now, maybe because I'm from the previous generation, I never felt like research would be a separate and attention-demanding thing of its own. I usually read up on a lot of things before, and then I kind of collected them like a bag of Legos. And then when it was time to use or draw upon that information, I always had them on hand. So I approached this from the opposite end, you could say. But of course, there are some tricks to make this personal research more efficient. I will tell you several methods I use. One of them is actually quite ridiculous. I use Pinterest, but I don't use it in a kind of muddled grab bag way. I have several distinct galleries, one for organisms, one for pictures of organisms, one for paleo art, one for outdated paleo art, one for cars, trains and boats, one for military stuff and aviation, another one for surreal art, another one for religious art, another one for exterior views, another one for interior views, and so on. You have to categorize things, and then when you research, your mind works more efficiently. Another technique I use, especially this is really useful for blind research, I like reading history books and travelogues and memoirs, and I always take notes at the back of the book. Now, note-taking is a dead art. You don't need a separate notebook for it. In fact, some recent young people find it almost impossible to take notes if they are not on an iPad, and I always view this with a grotesque sense of fascination. No, I just take notes on the last page of the book, which is usually empty, or the inner cover. And this is how blind research works. I was reading up on a travelogue to Greece, and there the author speaks about the Brassai frieze. Now, I never knew what this was. Turns out it's a very famous relief on the Parthenon. So I took notes. Another example from the same Greek travel book was a brief mention of something called the painted tombstones at Volos. That's Volos. Now, that's a very nice little town in central Greece. Turns out, near this town, they discovered ancient Hellenistic era tombstones with the actual paint still on them, making them some of the precious few actual paintings to survive to this day from before the Roman era. Now, there was no way for me to stumble into this without reading this book and without taking notes. So I really recommend this. There is no imagining what discoveries you can make. Another great example for reading and research and note-taking would be Wayne Barlow's classic Guide to Extraterrestrials and Wayne Barlow's Guide to Fantasy. Now, these are field guide style books about aliens and other fantasy characters. So there's a lot of alien drawings or fantastic creature drawings in them. And next to each character, Barlow has a source, which was the actual book that he read before painting that thing. And through that book, it's like a hub of a wheel. You can radiate to some of the great classic works of science fiction and fantasy. Strongly recommended. So in general, blind research, note-taking, reading actual books, extremely strongly recommended. Moving on. Do you see speculative evolutionary art and visual storytelling as a way of bridging the gap between science and ecological activism? Well, I think speculative evolution and visual storytelling can really make a difference connecting science and art, but in my personal approach, I never had a kind of ecological activist approach. Not that I don't like or support such efforts, I just never approached things that way. But now, thinking back, for example, one of the best books of speculative evolution, again by the aforementioned Wayne Douglas Barlow, is called Expedition. And this book is structured like a National Geographic article about a different planet. There are great paintings and some great pseudo-science writing. They go and explore this world and encounter these incredible creatures. And at the end, there's a note saying that somebody may have leaked the coordinates of this world to a cartel of alien hunters who descend upon this world and hunt these beautiful creatures with essentially drones. And the author laments that. The book actually begins by stating how Earth's ecosystems had collapsed a few centuries ago, and then humans were rescued by this benevolent alien race who gave them the keys to the galaxy in exchange of a responsible approach, a protective approach to nature. So now thinking about it, I think ecological activism is hard-baked into a lot of works with speculative evolution in mind. Another case to the point would be Dougal Dixon's Green World. It has not been published in Western countries, but it exists as a Japanese book, and it's all about a bunch of people colonizing this alien planet and accidentally destabilizing its ecosystems and creating an environmental catastrophe. So the short answer to this question is yes, there's a strong link, and especially visual storytelling itself, a picture is worth 1,000 words. So with speculative evolution, you can really tell moving stories that relate to our world as well. Moving on, number 5. I thought All Tomorrows was just fascinating. Well, thank you. If you don't know, All Tomorrows is my book, science fiction book about a fanciful future evolution of the human species, let us say. Did you build a narrative before illustrating the creatures, or was it the other way around? Well, I've been talking about this for the past half hour, and it was the other way around. I'm just bent wrong, I guess. I'm just wired that way. For me, there's no intention. Things come first, and the intention is kind of wrapped around them later like a creeping poisonous plant. So with All Tomorrows, it was just a portfolio of strange post-humans, and then I kind of designed the story around them later on when I realized that, wait a minute, you could make a book out of this. So that was that. Number 6. In your opinion, how does speculative evolution contribute to broader conversations about sustainability and conservation? I think sustainability has become a buzzword very recently. It connects to sometimes really fake and unsavory corporate practices of like fake recycling and astroturfing and greenwashing. But as I told you just before, I think speculative evolution is about nature, designing nature, a what-if approach to nature. And when you're taking the what-if approach, there's always a consideration for the present state of affairs. So as I just told you, I think environmental concerns were really hard-baked into the birth of this genre. In illustrating nature, even fantastic or non-existent nature, you invite people to think about them. And generally, people who would be interested in speculative evolution are almost always interested in nature and conservancy itself. And there's a big intersection space. If you made a Venn diagram of Spec-Evo enthusiasts, environmentalists, environmental scientists, science people, STEM people in general, there would be a great many people at the intersection of all these sets. So yeah, another All Tomorrows question. Why do you think All Tomorrows has seen such a recent surge in popularity? I think it was half luck, half zeitgeist. I hate that word, but it is what it is. All Tomorrows was published in 2006, and by published I mean I made it into a PDF and just popped it into Google Drive with a link, and then people began reading it themselves. In 2021, it was picked up by the very famous Alt-Shift-X YouTube channel, and now it has, I think, over 20 million views there. And that popularity resulted in my book taking off, and ultimately it led to me getting an actual book deal. So for that, I'm very grateful. In that zeitgeist bit, I think 2021 was a fitting year because it was the middle of the COVID pandemic, the so-called 15-day lockdown, which became 3 years long and ruined a lot of people's lives. It was an actual moment of catastrophe. And also it was a moment in which Gen Z, I think, really crossed the adolescent threshold and grew up and started becoming adults. I think all these things kind of like luckily coincided, and then the book was really popular. I think when I first wrote it, I was inadvertently expressing sentiments that only the next generation would be able to understand. So I think that was a nice thing, and for that I am always grateful. And final question from Ella Newey. What do you say is your favorite piece you made and why? Well, I think it's a very difficult question to answer because I am very bipolar about my own works. I love them sometimes I really cringe when I look at them. I always have these moments where I want to destroy older work, but of course I never do because I know the value of archiving things. But for example, just recently I had an enormous stash of big paintings I had made when I was like 15 or 16 years old. And obviously for me it was very amateurish stuff. Turns out I wanted to throw them away, but that week I had a university talk. I was invited by a local university to give a talk about speculative evolution, and I said, wait a minute, instead of throwing these old paintings into the waste basket, I just took them to this talk and I told everybody, you can have them, they're for free, and people just grabbed them up. They really loved them. And I had scans, so I did not feel bad about losing the actual works because I had them scanned and I can look at them anytime I want on my computer. But for those people, they became really formative, important gifts, and I was really happy because of that. The long story short is it always changes. I think if pressed to say, I would say maybe the work I did for Snaiad, the alien creatures I designed and I'm still designing for this speculative evolution project of my own, I think they're some of my best work and I'm really proud of them most of the time. Anyways, everybody, that was that. Answering questions from Ella Newey. Once again, apologies to Ella about this delay in production and thank you for your patience, I guess. And as always, I love you all. Have a nice holiday season, everybody. Goodbye.